Science, Research and Innovation Minister for 2 years between 2018 and 2020. During that time I was also fortunate enough to become the UK's Energy and Clean Growth Minister in 2019, attending Cabinet. And during that time I managed to get across the line the UK's legislative commitment to sign net zero into law, becoming the first G7 country to do so. And just reflecting actually on the reality of the politics behind that commitment, the UK is now very proud to say it's the first G7 country to have gone net zero and to place that into legislation. All that means having a legislative target that actually the government is now being taken to the courts over whether they've got enough detail in their net zero strategy. Demonstrates the importance of having legislation in place which you can be held accountable to. But at the time, there were lots of siren voices saying, why are we doing this? You know, why do we want to commit to net zero? What's the cost of net zero going to be? And the sort of figure of £1 trillion was being sort of floated around. To be honest with you, the then Chancellor wasn't that keen, and we managed to sort of do a deal with him behind the scenes. But the reality was, the UK beat France by 1 day in becoming that first G7 country to go net zero. It meant that our bid for COP27 was accelerated. And I was behind the scenes sort of ringing ministers bilaterally to try to see whether we can get support. And suddenly that net zero commitment took us across the line. And then fast forward 2 years on, we had the Glasgow Climate Pact, UK had the presidency of the G7, we had this sort of amazing climate leadership on net zero. And obviously we've seen Alex Sharma step down from his COP26 presidency role and hand this over to Egypt. And now the UK is very proud of its net zero commitments and demonstrating leadership on net zero, but it wasn't always the case. And I think it goes to show, when it comes to sort of narratives in the present and where you may be in the future, you have to fight for that investment. You've got to fight for that vision. Demonstrate to people that the change will happen. And I know obviously Carbon Clean was founded in 2009, and you may remember the UK government had previous commitments on carbon capture, £1 billion that was going to be put aside in 2010, and then was sort of slashed as part of George Osborne's austerity budget. And just think, if that £1 billion had been invested in 2010, how much the learning cost could have come down in CCUS. As was mentioned, in that time, the learning cost of solar has come down by 16 times. I now am in a fortunate place of being given a role to chair an independent review into net zero, looking how we can make net zero more pro-business, pro-enterprise, pro-growth. Now, we all know that net zero is all of those things. We're faced, again, with that reality of always having to explain and to defend and to set out the vision of why we are doing what we want to do, why it's important not just obviously to reduce our emissions for the climate, but for our future economy. Net zero is now the new economic reality. And with that comes the opportunity to embrace new industries, new opportunities for regeneration in post-industrial sites, in hard-to-abate communities that were mentioned, that recognise the need to change, but also feel that then sometimes they are being unfairly blamed for the historic position that they find themselves in. If you look at a number of the industrial sites across the UK, if you looked at Grangemouth and Ineos, where I was visiting on my net zero review tour recently, that was established in 1924. And it's still operating on the basis of actually that decision to locate the site there, providing most of the UK's petrochemicals for a range of industries that everyone uses. And no matter what people say about getting off oil and gas, they're still wearing clothes manufactured from the petrochemicals in that site. They're still travelling either on a plane or on public transport using the fuels that are manufactured on that site. So for anyone to turn around and somehow claim magically that net zero is going to eradicate the use of oil and gas in the next 3 decades, we know that they're sorely wrong. And even the Committee on Climate Change, the UK's independent body that was set up as part of our Climate Change Act back in 2008, has recognised that the UK will still be using 60% of the gas we're using now. So let's sort of put aside this argument that somehow we should somehow make the perfect the enemy of the good, because the good is the reality of what we live in. And when it comes to looking at our gas supply, when it comes to ensuring the lights stay on, the people will remain warm and are able to live the lives they wish to lead, it will be a huge mistake for proponents of net zero, proponents of taking action on climate change, to think that if you want to win this argument, you can somehow meet head on the fact that you've got to recognise that reality of life. And so very much the review I'm leading is looking now at implementation. As was mentioned, this is an implementation COP. We have our targets in place that the UK has set out, not just the net zero 2050 target. We've got those sub-targets, decarbonising the power supply, the transition to EVs, moving to heat pumps. And all those are tough targets. And what I'm determined to do as part of the review is look at how we implement these. How do we provide guardrails? How do we ensure that we can meet the paths that we've set out? And with that, I think, comes an important dual opportunity. Firstly, to identify barriers that are currently in the way. And so I've held, I think, so far 38 roundtables that I can see familiar faces who've been on some of those roundtables, so apologies for what I'm going to say now. But what I've done with the review is to try to set out not just a new narrative on net zero, so I'm sort of a new synthesis of why net zero is that primary economic agent that we need to embrace. But secondly, what are those barriers along a number of pathways? What are the pillars that we need to support in taking net zero forward? And I've identified 6 pillars. So the first pillar is securing net zero. That key point, I said, about global energy security supply. How can we ensure the transition is one that we can land, that we can recognise that we don't threaten our energy supply? So how do we ensure that we have security of supply chains, security of materials chains, security of skills chains? And with that comes a recognition that when we look at our existing industries, this is a transition. We cannot do without the infrastructures that we already have, and we must work with those infrastructures to adapt. Secondly, powering net zero. So thinking again, sector by sector, what are the barriers in the way? What are the debris on the pathways that we should be clearing? And that can be along a wide range of horizontals: government procurement, government competitions, government investment, skills, looking more broadly at legislation, regulation that's been mentioned. How can we ensure that we provide the smoothest possible path and can de-risk the cost of capital, and at the same time encourage inward investment? And with that is the recognition that we need stability, we need certainty, and we need clarity in our message as government. And no more sure than that is within CCUS and DAC. Providing that stability, that certainty, and that clarity of what the government mandate will be on CCUS is absolutely vital, as it is with many other industries. And for too long, the UK, I think, has led an approach which is fantastic in creating pilots, in creating demonstrators, in creating first-of-a-kinds. And actually, when you look at our Net Zero Industrial Hubs project, it's widely admired globally. But that's the problem, is that they remain demonstrators, they remain pilots. And that's the case with so many other areas of the net zero journey, is that we have fantastic examples of best practice. How can we stop best practice being best practice and being the new normal? And for myself, looking at CCUS, it's that how do we take that technology that we know already exists, that broadly existed back in 2009, it's not rocket science, it's quite simple science, to be honest with you. How can we ensure that we can de-risk the cost of capital by providing the government investment needed to then crowd in a private investment market which is ready and willing to go? And if I'm honest with you, looking across the landscape of investment in net zero projects, the reality is that when it comes to looking at government action, it's not just government inaction that is the problem in terms of delays in producing the regulation, in producing the business models, in holding back legislation that is ready to go. It's also the process itself of the competitions, of the ability to establish government procurement models that will provide and de-risk the certainty of private investment then coming alongside the government investment. And I remember as a science minister, when I used to tick off various R&D schemes, thinking, this is no way to think about the future. This is no way to provide certainty for the companies, that many of which all had very similar opportunities, very similar chances to succeed, yet there was that artificial cut-off line, and who made it above the line and who made it below the line. And I used to think, those people who made it below the line, what is going to happen now to those projects? And I remember going to several of them actually and saying, well, it's fallen apart. Our investors have gone elsewhere. And that's the reality of where we are with our current government frameworks. If you went to a school, you wouldn't cut off 50% of the pupils and say, I'm sorry, that's it, you've had your chance. You would work with them and continue to make that investment and recognise, particularly when it comes to climate change, just as when it comes to education and providing a future workforce, we need everyone. We need all technologies. And so I think when we look at what's currently in place, yes, obviously the government has its Track 1 cluster project, and it's been important for demonstrating the framework, but we're going to need everything. We're going to, I believe, as the UK, if we want to become leaders, if we want to be able to demonstrate the leadership that we showed when it came to net zero in working to get the Glasgow Climate Pact, we need now to show future leadership on innovation and implementation. And that is a recognition that actually we've got to be able to think about how to be more flexible in our approach to investment. We've got to be able to work with industry and follow their ambitions. And I see very clearly when I go up to HyNet, Net Zero Teesside, industries that want to move further and faster. And actually it's the government that's holding them back. And there's other industries, thanks to the IRA in the States, which now sort of will go elsewhere. And so for the UK, and I know we're having a global conversation today, I'm concerned that we obviously want to collaborate, we want to ensure that we innovate and we recognise the opportunities for new technologies to go further and faster with that opportunity to collaborate. But we're only going to de-risk the cost of capital, we're only going to get that learning curve down if we ensure we have as many people working on the job at the same time. And so for myself, trying to look at how we can review net zero, review those pathways, review how the government can catalyse investment is absolutely critical. Because talk's cheap, the strategy is just words on a paper. Making it a reality is what you all want to do in this room. We recognise, as was mentioned with the IEA statistics, that we cannot achieve net zero without carbon capture. And it's not just about 2050, it's not some magical panacea which is we're going to solve climate change by 2050. We need to start now about 2100, 2150 in the long term, and what that means for deploying CCUS and then also DAC. An enormous scale-up challenge that requires its own mission in the same way Kennedy set that mission in '61 to say you're going to get a man to the moon, and they achieved it in 9 years. They managed to get a man to the moon in 9 years in the 1960s. Surely in 9 years it's not impossible for us to match that challenge using the technology which is quite basic in order to be able to make our climate commitments a reality. So I hope today that you're able to come up with a continued conversation, not just on what you need, but what you think you can do for the future. Because that's the other thing I find doing the review. I've said 38 roundtables. It's fascinating to see, obviously, common areas where people are agreeing what those barriers are. Deploying cost of capital, length of time it takes the projects, planning, government uncertainty. I recognise all of that. But then I also sort of throw back that challenge to yourselves and say, okay, what does long-term certainty look like for you? How are we going to move from clusters through to dispersed sites? And obviously there's a responsibility for government to recognise the importance of dispersed sites. But for yourselves, working in collaboration and recognising your own companies are natural competitors, and that's great in a capitalist market. It will bring greater opportunities, greater value for the taxpayer. But demonstrating to government that you are united in one voice about what you want to achieve, what's the mission that you want to set, what's your ambition in terms of the carbon you wish to capture or the hydrogen you wish to produce, is equally important for me. Because when you look at what's happened in the States, having that mandate, having that certainty at the end is both important as for government as it is for the private sector. So hopefully you can use this discussion today to also think about where you need to go for the future and to reflect that back into governments like myself, into reviews that I'm taking forward. And hopefully when the review comes out beginning of next year, we can sort of set out what is the new mandate for CCUS, what needs to be taken forwards by government, not just this year coming up, but also in the medium term and the long term, recognising that there is this opportunity, but the cost of inaction is also the risk. The risk for government of obviously investment going elsewhere, but the risk for all of us in actually pathways closing. If we'd taken the choices we had 10 years ago, we'd been in a far better place when it came to actually looking at the amount of carbon dioxide that we needed to capture for the future. So this is exponential. We have an exponential opportunity, but we also have an exponential risk that we need to address. So I hope that you can use the discussion today to come up with new ideas and to challenge government about how we implement for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you. Chris, thank you for those remarks, and I know you have a very, very busy schedule today, so you have to leave. But thank you for joining. I want to now invite our panelists onto the stage And as Chris said, this is actually the time for implementation. So we are also thinking about what is it that we can do as an industry? What are those experiences that we can all bring? I want to invite Alistair Philip Davies, CEO of SSE, Vicente Saiso, VP Sustainability from CEMEX. You can sit. And then Yoichi Noburisaka from Marubeni. So I want to kick off this panel discussion with a focus on implementation. But before we get there, I want to actually introduce the panel, and I actually want the panel to introduce themselves. Alistair, maybe we could get started from you first.
Is that better? Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. My name's Alistair Phillips Davis. I'm the Chief Executive of SSE. We're a mainly UK and Ireland-based integrated utility. We're doing a lot of things which will hopefully be very helpful for the energy transition and for getting to net zero. We're building more offshore wind than anybody on the planet currently. We're also building the world's largest offshore wind farm. We have a plan that we announced or updated earlier this year to invest £25 billion in green infrastructure. That covers transmission. Our transmission business we expect to grow from something like a £4 billion asset value to well in excess of £12 billion by the end of the decade, as we look to hook up a lot of the renewables off the north of Scotland and bring that down south. And we're also keenly interested, while renewables will do the heavy lifting, looking at carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. These are both areas that are essential if we're going to provide power to society generally when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining. These are really, really important technologies. I've been involved all the way back to 2005 in the UK with carbon capture technologies, when the government first looked at doing something at Peterhead. Chris Skidmore referred to George Osborne's further attempt when we tried again at Peterhead in 2015 with Shell to get something done. And obviously this time we've got 3 or 4 projects that we're doing with various partners across the UK, principally Equinor, across all the industrial hubs there. And we've also announced with Equinor the first full world sort of grid scale hydrogen plant at Keadby or Keadby 4, where we're looking to put a sort of 800 megawatt turbine that's burning pure hydrogen as well, and some of that may be driven by carbon capture technology in terms of producing hydrogen. So we think that this technology and working with people like Carbon Clean incredibly important in driving forward the agenda for net zero and delivering, certainly over this decade, a significant step forward on the journey to net zero overall.
Thank you. Yoichi?
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Yoichi Noburisaka. I'm based in London, responsible for the Marubeni's entire infrastructure investment in Europe. So Marubeni, like other companies, we are also announcing net zero target 2050. And in term, we announced 2030, we reduce 50% of the scope 1 and 2, the baseline 2019. And also scope 3, 20%. We also announced that we are one of the biggest IPP players in the world. We reduced our coal-fired power station capacity half by 2025, and also zero by 2050. So this is the decarbonization is quite important. And in February this year, Marubeni also announced the midterm strategic plan. In that, the green investments are the key focus. So based on that, we have lots of initiatives in hydrogen, biomethane, and sustainable aviation fuel, and also carbon capture. So the Carbon Clean is one of our key partner and core partner. That's why we made investment in 2020. So.
Thank you. Vicente?
Hello. Thank you. My name is Vicente Saiso. I'm VP of Sustainability for CEMEX. CEMEX is a global building materials manufacturer. We produce cement, concrete, aggregates, and as well as other products. We have presence in all the world. we have a challenge as an industry, as cement producers. You know that we, as a sector, are responsible for close to 7 to 8% of global CO2 emissions. So we have been working at mitigating CO2 for a long time, and now has come the time to go faster and to go deeper into the decarbonization phase. We have a very clear target and roadmap for 2030. Yesterday we got verified by the SBTi under the 1.5 scenario, which is the most aggressive for our industry. For the road for 2030, we have proven technologies that we have implemented in Europe for a long time, and now we are expanding quickly to the rest of our operations. We are doing that very fast, and we are doing that very effectively, even in countries like our developing economies like Egypt. We have here our head for Egypt. We have managed to reduce emissions in a very short period of time in a big fashion. So we are really deploying globally all these solutions that we know. But for our industry, 60% of emissions come from our chemical process, limestone, and it emits CO2. So we have part of that, of those emissions that are difficult or complex or challenging to deal with, and definitely we need to have carbon capture to go all the way to carbon neutrality. And so therefore we have started to develop an open collaboration agenda, and start to create an ecosystem of collaboration with companies like Carbon Clean to place bets on the technologies that look the most promising, to be the ones that will be more effective in capturing carbon, and to be able to scale up fast, and also to be adaptable to different plant configurations. No? We have 45 integrated cement plants across the world, so it will be a different solution for each plant, no? And we like the modularity and scalability of solutions like Carbon Clean, no? So this innovation phase that we are entering is completely new in our industry. We were quite of a stable industry with no big technological jumps needed. But now the market is demanding low carbon products, and we need to go all the way, no? So we are partnering with many companies like Carbon Clean, and trying to figure out which will be the winning technologies that will be scalable and obviously have the lower cost as we move forward.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that I've heard this time around is we need everything to work. We need all the solutions. There is no single silver bullet. You know, in the audience here, we have other industry. We have some people from financing community and people who actually are implementing the projects as well. So I think I want to hear from your perspectives, very different, diverse perspectives. What are the strategies that you're seeing and you're thinking you're deploying, and what are the couple of options that you're actually deploying? Those are outside your normal business.
Okay. Look, I think one of the key things here is that you've got to keep governments on side, and we need to keep society generally on side. Chris mentioned, I think, civil society, or we heard that mentioned earlier. Essentially, for me, therefore, a big part of that is around a just transition. I think we're fortunate that in a lot of the places that we're looking to go into for carbon capture technologies, these industrial clusters, there's real opportunity to transfer people from high carbon industries to low carbon industries, therefore taking the time and effort to retrain people and to offer that genuinely just transition where you're maintaining communities. If you're moving people away, or you're creating entirely new hubs a long way away from where communities are, and they're becoming disaffected, I think that's where you'll get problems. And we saw that probably in the US with the election of the previous president. That was definitely something that was played on. So I see government policy and a just transition has been critical going forward. That's something that we're certainly very aware of. How do we create jobs, and how do we make sure that we look after the people and the locations that will be could be left behind by this transition to new technologies? For us, that is around commitment of large amounts of capital. Essentially, we have to find a way to put our capital in there. We also have to make sure that government policy is there so that we can get other people to commit to things like project financing, and we can bring other investors in. For ourselves, is a critical part of the £12.5 billion we're spending between now and 2026. Equinor is one of our key partners in the deployment of these technologies. We're also going after several hubs in the UK. We've got two that we're already well advanced with at Peterhead in Scotland, and then a Keeby with the industrial cluster around Humberside and Teesside. We've also invested recently with Equinor £340 million in acquiring a further generation portfolio that importantly includes Salt End, which is out right by the sea, sort of where that industrial cluster I think will start in terms of carbon capture. And then partnering, which we've already heard from CEMEX, we need other industrial users to be in those clusters, so that if we move forward from power generation back to based on CCS, or CCS is just providing hydrogen for whatever purpose, we can utilise that for other industrial processes that will be much harder to decarbonise later on. So I think the initial phase for us is definitely all about about power production, but what we need to do is make sure that within a decade we can migrate the CCS facilities away from that power production into industrial processes as well, and that's why these industrial clusters are so important. I certainly spoke on a big panel a year ago in Glasgow on this, with globally ones from Perth to Los Angeles down in Spain and whatever, and I know there's a real commitment to trying to get 100 clusters around the world going. We obviously fantastic to hear that Aramco have announced a really big ambitious project yesterday. These are things that we need to push forward. I think the last year we've seen a lot of work underneath the radar, but we haven't seen that many big announcements, and that's what we want to see in the UK. I think we've got 4 big opportunities there. It'd be fantastic to be able to convert one of them, working with Equinor and working with other people like Carbon Clean.
Yoichi, you're investing all over the world. You're investing in offshore wind, you're investing in other renewables, you're investing in hydrogen and CCS. How do you sort of square this with the ambition that you have at Marubeni? How are you prioritizing this, and how are you thinking about this?
Yes, there are actually this decarbonization is actually opportunity for Marubeni, and there are lots of initiatives that we are doing, as I mentioned, hydrogen, and biomethane, sustainable aviation fuel, and also the carbon capture. And also offshore wind farm, we are actually doing together with the SSE in Scotland. This is also one of the big investment we are going to make in the UK, 2.6 gigawatt offshore wind farm. We don't have any prioritized area of the investment in terms of the decarbonization. We want to do all, and where the business opportunity is there, we will make the investment. So the carbon, if we are talking about the carbon capture, for example, the biomethane, in UK there's a green gas support scheme. In Europe there's REPower EU initiatives. So there are lots of people or government try to enhancing or encouraging the biomethane productions. And Marubeni also made an investment in UK and also in the United States. So in order to produce the biomethane, there's the upgrade from biogas to biomethane by extracting the CO2. So the carbon capture is very important part of it for our new investment. In terms of our existing investment, greener our investments, we have also huge volume or capacity of the coal-fired power station as well as the gas-fired power station. This is our initiative to decarbonize our existing gas-fired power station or thermal power stations. We have already started the conversation with Carbon Clean about how can we decarbonize our power stations. The power stations, the CO2 content is not big, so it's very important to have very competitive carbon capture technologies. Otherwise, the cost is very high, so it does not make sense for us to decarbonize in our power station. So I believe this carbon capture Carbon Clean is taking a very important role for our investments.
Thank you. Vicente, I think from your side as well, you mentioned achieving the lowest carbon footprint per ton of cement that you achieved, and congratulations for getting certified by SBT. I mean, this definitely we think. What are a couple of the levers that you are pulling in to be able to achieve this and stay on the target?
Well, in the short term, and as I was mentioning, for 2030, there are a few levers that give us the most buck for the money in terms of reducing CO2, which is using alternative raw materials to use less of the intermediate material called clinker, that is the most energy intensive. We tend to do blended cements with those alternative raw materials. Some of the materials can also be used in the first phase of our production. They are already decarbonated, so there will be no additional emission of CO2. We are doing that big time in Europe to reduce that. We are the first in our industry to start using hydrogen as a catalyzer to improve the combustion process in our kilns. But hopefully hydrogen becomes part of our fuel mix in the future. So there we have also synergies with other industries that are looking at hydrogen as well. And always trying to do innovation in the way that we used to do things to be able to capture more. Fossil fuels for us are also a relevant lever to reduce them. We are using solid municipal waste to substitute fossil fuels with solid municipal waste that has high biomass content, that has carbon neutrality embedded into it. That's one of the most relevant things that we are doing. No? But then, as I was saying, that's the immediate medium term or short term, but then we need transformational technologies, no? Carbon capture. We also are going into technologies that will allow to separate our emissions from chemical process from the combustion emission process to have more purity. And that is a very interesting concept because it can be combined with a carbon capture technology, no? and be more effective. And we are trying to put all this together. We have, let's say, defined one of our plants in Europe, located in Germany, in Rudersdorf, to be the first net zero CO2 plant in our system. We hope that by 2030 we can achieve that. Carbon Clean is part of that effort in trying to mix different types of solutions and technologies. No, that carbon neutral alliance that we have created incorporates green hydrogen production that will go together with the CO2 to produce jet fuels. The plant is in a good location that potentially will provide jet fuel for the Berlin airport and all the airlines that are located there. So this will be a test ground for different technologies, and we are finding that different technologies that we were pursuing individually can be mixed together to provide a holistic solution for one plant. And that's going to be a very interesting concept moving forward. And in addition to this plant in Germany, now we are identifying 2 or 3 more plants in Europe to go further. Europe is a good testing ground because it has strong regulatory framework that favors circular economy and new technologies, has also very good support for innovation in terms of funds from governments. We are also finding that now with the IRA Act in the US, there's also very interesting incentives in the US to develop technologies. In California, where we are present, there's a carbon market in place, as well as Europe. So those are going to be the 2 places where we are going to get more support, and obviously those can help us develop the technology that then will later can be applied to the rest of operations in the world. No?
But this is a great example, that a cement company in Europe trying to sort of diversify into producing fuels, renewable fuels. I mean, it's a completely different example. And I think this is exactly what Chris was talking about. We need those business models. We need leadership on that. I think I also want to hear from you, Ichi, and then from you, Alistair. Are there examples of demonstration projects where you have actually gone and done something, and then now you're saying, oh, there's a new business model here?
Yeah, so we have also a few demonstration hydrogen project in UK. This project is actually funded by UK government or subsidized partly by UK government and also the Japanese government. So initially, they are quite important for us to have this subsidy to hit the FID of the project. We have other initiatives in continental Europe. We are struggling to hit FID because of the regulation is not there yet for the hydrogen production, and also the subsidy is yet to be granted. So I think the first initial phase of this demonstration, the subsidy or the government support is quite essential.
But maybe you could probably talk about the project in Japan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also it is a cement industry, so we have supplied the first carbon clean unit in Japan in beginning of this year. This is to the Taiheiyo Cement. It's a demonstration plant. Is actually funded by Japanese government. So all those initiatives is actually funded by the Japanese government, yeah, or some government.
Absolutely, Alistair.
Just probably a couple of things I'll try and focus on. Initially, I think for the UK, I think we want to see the UK show a little more ambition than they have currently. So there's a business model around something called dispatchable CFDs. You've got a contract for difference, but it's got flexibility in it. The problem that we would have with that is that at the moment they've only committed to one cluster. I think we've obviously seen Chris Skidmore here today, and he's been here for a few days. Also Grant Shapps, who's the new Secretary of State, is here. So we've certainly been talking to them about showing more ambition, going for 4 to 6 plants between now and 2030, which I think will give far more benefits in terms of understanding how we deploy these technologies, one at scale, and also far more cheaply in terms of building a supply chain that can then really deliver. So I would say the principal way at the moment in the UK that they're looking at that is through there's grant funding to move into some of these processes, and then we've got these dispatchable CFDs which will provide a model going forward. And it seems to me very much like when we were in the early days of offshore wind, there were quite high CFD payments. Offshore wind was over £100 a megawatt hour in the UK. Now, all the recent contracts have been more like £40 a megawatt hour, so something like a 70% reduction in prices from the initial peak. I think the UK's demonstrated how that can be done. It's demonstrated how you can create the biggest offshore market in the world, which it did for wind, and we've got huge opportunities in carbon capture and storage, particularly because we've got so many depleted offshore gas fields that we've been working on for 40, 50 years that'll provide something there. And then for us specifically, government I think has given us a 10 to 15 million pound grant. We've just announced a project, a fairly unique project in the UK, where we're going to take something like a green electrolyser, store the hydrogen underground. We own about 40% of the onshore gas storage in the UK, and then run that back through a CCGT to provide flexible generation to the grid, and we'll generate the hydrogen when power prices are low. I think it's a sort of adjacent technology for us, but again, if we can demonstrate that you can put peakers in that can burn hydrogen, I think that'll be a really important part of what we're doing, because Equinor are looking at essentially a methane to hydrogen plant based on carbon capture technology as well. And the key thing for us is that hydrogen production and hydrogen usage are both pretty low at the moment, and we need to really increase those. And so however we can do that, however we can show uses for it, so if we build that CCS hydrogen plant in the UK, initially we could could put that through generation if it's needed, and then obviously we can use that hydrogen for different uses, whether that be in fuel cells or other things. So I definitely see CCS and hydrogen as very linked technologies and things that where we need to move forward with some of these important demonstration projects and do them at significant industrial scale. That one hydrogen project I talked about for us will probably be a 70 to 100 megawatt generation unit and probably be a total of about £200 million worth of investment, something like that, to provide that end-to-end process.
I fully agree with you. And, I think for the industrial decarbonization, it's so important to actually try and do everything. You'll most likely achieve the lowest cost denominator with hydrogen, green hydrogen, with CCS, maybe biomass, alternative fuels, electrification. So you probably need to go and sort of pursue everything. We're probably heading towards the end, so I want to get towards one question which I think I've been asked a couple of times and a couple of our customers have asked the same question, is how do we communicate the story around we have to try quite a few things, or a few things at least, to achieve that lowest cost decarbonization. And I think you're definitely the leaders who are already doing it. How are you communicating the story around that to your shareholders and the other constituents?
So, look, clearly events like COP26 and events like you're holding here today are really important in terms of getting the story out, and delighted we've got so many people in the audience. Obviously, events like this bring government bodies and they bring media in, so I think it's important to shine a light on what we're doing. I think most people get the fact that renewables, which are going to do the heavy lifting on decarbonisation of the energy system and actually provide the energy for the future, are often intermittent, and therefore trying to provide some kind of flexibility is important. I don't think there's enough long duration storage in the world. Things like pumped hydro, it's clearly a part of it, and therefore synthetic fuels that can be moved around and used in different areas are really important. And obviously there are huge resources in terms of depleted gas fields around there, which are also important. It's probably whether it's CEMEX or other companies, just noting how much carbon they emit. I think people really understand coal-fired power stations, gas-fired power stations emit a lot of carbon, but just the carbon coming out of industrial processes that are critical to produce very everyday things, whether it's fertilizers, steel, cement, that build properties and all the rest of it. I think there's probably a bit more to be done on communicating how important that industrial decarbonisation is, and how important decarbonisation is, and how important it will be in terms of creating green jobs in the future. Essentially, the investments that government make, if they provide subsidies, are going to create these new green job clusters, which are going to be really important. That's what I like so much about the industrial decarbonisation and these industrial hubs that we're trying to create. But I think there is more of a story for people to tell, and for each of those individual projects to be out there lobbying and to be letting people know. At the end of the day, a lot of the people that those industrial hubs support are basically voters who are really going to influence politicians' opinions. So I think there's more to be done on that as we get more granularity. But I see strong partnership with industrial partners, but it's just how we communicate that more widely and get people excited about the journey ahead of us.
Yes, I think we need the effort of each stakeholders, including the project developers and also the user of this decarbonized energy or green energy, and also the government. So as MP mentioned, the private money is ready, including Marubeni. Recently, we have a discussion with the setting CCU project together with Carbon Green, and try to sell the CO2 to the industrial gases. But there might be a slightly higher cost than the CO2 from a normal industry. So we are asking, try to optimize the cost, but maybe still the cost is still higher. So I think if there's some governmental support on subsidies, that might be reducing the cost, and also the stakeholder can afford to buy probably slightly higher cost than the normal CO2. Also mentioned the registration or rules is quite important. We are ready, but some of the project is stuck because of this rule is not ready yet. So I think each stakeholder's effort to make it happen I think that is important for us.
No, and I fully agree, and I just want to come to that point where I think there has been a realization that subsidy is not necessarily a dirty word. Look what it has done for solar industry, look what it has done for the wind industry, and what it is doing for the hydrogen, for the battery industry. I think these are the kickstarters you need to actually get a completely new industry going, and then we can all go and commercialize that and create green jobs around that. Sorry.
Yes, no, and not to be repetitive, I think it's very important what you mentioned on industrial clusters, because there are synergies, those help to get the scale up. So I think that's very important part of the narrative. Now, narrative as a company, what we are trying to explain is that we have a broad portfolio of testing different technologies, placing smart bets in those technologies, because we think there will be not one single one that will be the winner. And as I mentioned, most probably there will be a combination of different technologies that you will use in one place, and then start at the same time in parallel to develop a few large-scale projects where you can start to demonstrate the feasibility of those different technologies that you are testing. No? So in parallel, have a broad portfolio of smart bets, and then apply those to larger scale projects with good government support, and hopefully at some point in time you will get enough clarity to convey to your investors and different stakeholders what will be the investment required to do that. No, it's important to manage that expectation of uncertainty, because in these new technologies, in some of them are in early stage, there's a lot of uncertainty. So manage the expectations of our investors that we don't have all the answers yet, and we don't have a clear way of calculating what's going to be the investment level required, but for sure, as we move along, we will have that clarity established, and at that point in time we are going to be able to communicate even more precisely. No? Also relevant to say that CO2 should not be seen as a negative, because it can become a key ingredient or a raw material for the production of other processes, and I'm sure it will play an important role also moving forward. No? Where it might become a very looked after input, no? for other processes. So I think that's also an alternative, and for sure it can happen. No?
We certainly are waiting for and cheering for that. I do want to go into the next part of communication, which is actually listening from the audience. So I want to open the floor for any questions for the panelists.
Good morning, and thank you very much for a really interesting session. I work for a company called Petrofac. We're a UK but globally based EPC provider, so we build these projects that we're all planning to do in order to get to net zero. In fact, we are delivering the Seagreen offshore wind substation and onshore substation for SSE. A question to the panel: what are you doing to engage the supply chain to ensure that the capacity is there to build these projects? And let me give you a bit of context to this question. So we're seeing a huge amount of projects coming across in the UK and across in Europe and now in America. One of my colleagues was at a carbon capture conference last week where Aker Solutions actually said that they've seen a 65% increase in inquiries from the US based on the IRA, the act that's coming in, that's giving security. I was also at a Pipeline Industries Guild dinner last week. We're looking at the HyNet cluster, about all these pipelines that need to be built to connect the emitters, connect the hydrogen producers to the hydrogen off-takers. There's two major companies in the UK that deliver pipelines. They told me they need 140 welders for 2 years for a 30-kilometre pipeline for one part of HyNet. They don't have those. It takes 3 years to train someone up. So my concern is that we'll find that these projects get to FID, that we want to move forward, and actually we won't find the supply chain that EPCs like us rely on, and our subcontractors, because we're going to have to train these people, we're going to have these skills, and we're in a global market where those people will go to the US, to Europe, to Saudi Arabia, for instance. So I just wondered what the panel were doing to try and engage their supply chain to ensure they can deliver these projects.
Thank you. Anyone?
Yeah, so we've got one project at the moment at Kibi, so Kibi 3 that we're looking at. We're going through detailed feed studies on that to get prices. Inflation's a big issue on that. So, I think just more generally, whether it's across the whole renewables, carbon capture, hydrogen supply chain, the latest bout of inflation is yet really to come through. And I think a lot of companies have been burnt in that space, and therefore risk premiums and almost contract structures and what you can fix and what you can't are proving a real problem. So I think we're starting that process in detail on Kibi 3 to almost kind of get to a final investment decision. I do think there are probably big issues, as you say. There are lots of inquiries and there are lots of twinkles in people's eyes as to what they might do, but there isn't that much commitment. And if we look around the UK, essentially the supply chain and the sub-supply chain from Petrofac and other companies like yourselves, they're probably sitting there saying at the moment the high-level UK policy is only for one. There's not the certainty here to go and build. There's not the certainty to take on another 50 welders today and start training them up. That's why I think we've got some big problems around that government commitment, clarity on subsidy, and then getting the financing when cost of capital are changing. It's obviously great that the US inflation rates outperformed yesterday and markets recovered heavily, but still I've got concerns about where cost of capital have gone generally, where inflation's going, and where there's a levelized market, and then trying to feed that down into the supply chain. So I think it's probably a relatively big concern, because on offshore wind and other things we're going reasonably well, but nobody's built one of these big things at scale. It's also why we're looking to do that hydrogen project and probably try and fund that ourselves with one partner. It's kind of, I think some of the big companies like us are going to have to take some risk on early stage development and commitment to try and get that there. And just final point is more on the transmission side of my business, but saw a couple of the big HVDC producers here this week, and we've got a program of probably 5 2,000 megawatt HVDCs we want, so we'll need 10 boxes and 5 cables basically to put those together. But they're crying out for certainty, which we hope we can provide over the next several months, and then they're going to have to try and scale up. One of them's seen a 60% increase in their business in that area this year alone. Therefore, just pure availability of people, and then my materials is a problem. So I think supply chain is one of the biggest issues that we have to bridge, and it's why we're desperately trying to get government policy to be here, try and keep companies like yours here, and then how do the developers or deployers of technology like us, big utilities, try and bridge that gap in a sensible way. But I can't say anything other than it's a big concern for us at the moment.
Vicente or Fuichi, you want to add something?
Yes. So that is actually the biggest problem. So we are actually pushing every day to carbon clean when you can deliver the project of what cost. That's the everyday challenge right now. And not only carbon clean, but also other hydrogen projects. Let's say now the electrolyzer producer select the project, not we choose the electrolyzer producers. So this kind of the supply chain problem, and also the project around the world is competing each other. So I think we have to demonstrate the certainty to the project, to the suppliers, that otherwise supplier won't choose us. That's the problem we are facing right now.
And I would complement by saying that when we find the technology that is quite proven, that we found that it works, what we immediately tell our suppliers is what is our expectation of the implementation that we are going to do in all of our plants, and make a timeline, not of it can be done in 2 or 3 years. For example, we are doing that with hydrogen. No? So there is no big hurry to do immediately everything at the same time. So if we create a timeline of deliveries for the next 2 or 3 years, we will be okay because we will be covering our geographies. We give priority to those geographies that have a carbon price and we can extract more profitability out of it. And then the most difficult part is for technologies that are early stage. And Iruda was asking me the other day, yesterday, that if we can give him clarity on what's coming. I still don't have an answer for him, no. But hopefully, when we start to create these larger scale projects, as soon as we create the concept, then we can send a strong signal to the potential suppliers of the equipment that will go there, of what's going to happen here. No, I think we have the advantage that these technologies are going to take some time to develop. So for at least for us, we will be not in a hurry to do everything. So we can really set a timeline in which we can take longer than usual, because we will be experimenting at the same time. No? But for those where we have clarity, we give very clear signal, a commitment, and we establish together a roadmap of how they can supply to us in a timely fashion, but given time for them to be able to disperse the effort in a reasonable period of time.
I would add, I think from a power point of view, I'm really concerned because I think we're in a big hurry. Just in the UK, you've got 2030 goals to deliver. Trying to do that, we're in a real big hurry, and time is really marching against us, I would say. So for us, we're probably more concerned, how does the UK get 5 or 6 of these things done and implemented and working by 2030? That's a big challenge from just some of the things you've said.
With that, I'd like to draw the panel to close. We're running a bit over, but I do want to mention, if we go back 3 or 4 years back, probably hydrogen or green hydrogen was in a similar place where people started building gigafactories. There are 5 of them now under construction, and I think with CCS at Carbon Clean, at least we are trying to do that. We are focusing a lot on scalable, modular, replicable carbon capture equipment that could be mass produced and then can be deployed. Bring the cost down, but at the same point of time, give the users certainty on timing and cost, which I think is absolutely key. I do want to thank our panelists. I think it's been very clear and loud message that CCS is not just an option, it is an absolute necessity, and we all have to keep at it and actually deliver on it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Ian Tobin. I have the privilege of being Carbon Clean's Chief Corporate Officer and CFO. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker, Harry Boycott, who's Senior Partner at McKinsey Sustainability.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, everybody. So yes, my name's Harry Boycott. I've been asked to provide a few independent perspectives from McKinsey's point of view about the market for CCUS. And yes, I am going to do that. But I think it's also important that we go further from just reflecting about the market. So, as Annie said up front, this is the delivery or implementation COP. And so what I'd like to do is briefly lay out what we think about the market, but then spend most of our time thinking about what are the barriers that are getting in the way of scaling this industry in the way that we need to. And then I'd like to offer some specific suggestions for what businesses, regulators, and investors can do. Now, I've got 2 main thoughts for you today. The first is that I didn't know what Annie and Chris were going to say in their opening remarks. And as an independent observer, there is considerable conceptual alignment between the 3 of us. And so rather than seeing my remarks as duplication, I think we should think about this as a source of confidence, because there is increasing clarity about the landscape in which we're operating, and that gives us, I think, a good platform to pivot forward into delivery. And the second thing that I would say is that amongst the fiendishly tricky combination of things that are needed to deliver a net zero global economy, it's my belief that CCUS has one of the clearest tailwinds It is ripe for acceleration, especially in industrial point source CCUS. And the best way to accelerate that delivery is to take what we're calling a mindset of playing offense. And I'll talk a bit more about what that looks like in a minute. So, the market overview stuff, just to quickly set the scene for all of us. Today, as Annie said, we've got just over 40 million tons per year of capacity installed. Just over half of that is in the US, and most of it is in oil and gas production. And if you look at the current pipeline of projects that have been announced, not including the one that you announced this morning, Annie, with Aramco, this gets us to about 110 million tons per annum by 2030. And about half of that is already in construction or late stage development. But asserting that pipeline is not the same thing as asserting how much we need. Now, I've always believed that mathematics is much easier than stargazing, and anyone who can tell you with, clarity exactly what we need and what's going to happen is suffering from an excess of self-confidence. So at McKinsey, we decided not to go down that path, but rather do the easy thing and do some of the maths. And so we laid out how much capacity we need under a range of different future scenarios. One of them was around fading momentum. One of them was our current trajectory. The next was whether we have future acceleration of our current trajectory, where a cluster of countries make bold bets to move us faster than we are right now. The next scenario was, what would it take for us to deliver the commitments that have already been made by nations? And then the final one is the 1.5 degree scenario. And it's the middle three, the trajectory, acceleration, and achieved commitments, that we're using as our plausible range. And they get us to somewhere between 2.5 and 4.2 gigatons of capacity a year by 2050. About 80% of which will come from cement, blue hydrogen, and iron and steel. And if you wind those numbers back, and just anchoring on the 4.2 gigaton scenario for a moment, if you wind that back to 2030, that's about 715 million tons per annum of capacity that we will need. These numbers, by the way, are really aligned with the numbers, Annie, that you were quoting earlier in your opening remarks. So the scale of expansion that we need is absolutely considerable. And of course, these scenarios are not static. Even the 1.5 degree scenario that we've laid out, and of course there are a bunch of people just over there who are discussing right now the politics and the deliverability of 1.5 degrees. But even the 1.5 degree scenario is not the ceiling for this market. So let's imagine that we're delivering the commitments that have been made by countries already. Well, the amount of carbon capture and storage that you need differs depending on how all sorts of other things play out. So let's imagine for a moment that the build-out of renewable energy in the US does not move as fast as we expect because of land prices. Let's imagine for a moment that India and China choose not to strand younger fossil assets that they have right now. In those kind of outcomes, the market could be as great as 6 gigatons per year. So there's a lot of variability around these scenarios that depend on the way in which renewable assets and existing fossil assets play out over the next decade or so. So I think, Annie, Chris, the panel have said that the role that CCUS plays in our journey to a net zero global economy is absolutely clear. But what's equally clear is that the trajectory that we're on is insufficient. So what are we going to do to accelerate? And one of the main themes that I've been hearing during this week at COP27 is how to understand capital risk and capital deployment. This came up in one of the panels that I was on yesterday. Yuichi mentioned it just now as well. There is this sense that there is sufficient capital waiting to be deployed, but not yet being mobilized at the pace that we need. That is as true for CCUS as it is for other climate technologies, but CCUS also has a number of unique characteristics that I think are important when we think about what it's going to take to scale. The first thought here is that within the three broad CCUS approaches, so industrial point source, direct air capture, and bioenergy with carbon capture, it's industrial point source that we believe is going to be the most important in the short and medium term, because as Chris said earlier, the technology is ready. In fact, I think Pratik said it was simple, so good on you. But the technology is ready, and it can capture volumes from hard-to-abate industrial sectors, another big theme of COP this week. So we think that this particular CCUS approach is the most important in the short term. So how do you get that to scale? And as many people today have already said, we need to jump to hubs. There's lots of excitement about hubs, and of course they are necessary. They provide good economies of scale, but as Chris alluded to earlier, they are not sufficient. The real challenge with scaling industrial point source CCUS is how we deploy capital at scale across the sites of more than 25,000 industrial emitters in 11 sectors around the world. So we have a distributed capital challenge to overcome. And we see 5 main barriers that are getting in the way. The first, as Alistair touched on a little bit, and as the question touched on the last panel, is uneven and uncertain policy. The technology in carbon capture and storage with industrial point source emissions combines a lot of different things in ways that are often first of a kind. And as it combines those things in different ways, the policy landscape that can stimulate them is still evolving. And there will be a portfolio of direct incentives for things like supporting shared infrastructure. There will be indirect incentives, things like carbon prices and voluntary markets. There will be regulatory enablers like permitting. And there are also big questions that need to be addressed like monopoly risk or subsurface risk. Now, the particular balance of these things is evolving. And I'm not arguing here for international homogeneity. I actually think there's a real role for countries to differentiate their posture on this. But exactly as we heard at the end of that last panel, international differentiation is absolutely possible in an environment that gives clarity now so that organizations can invest in building the skills and talent that they will need. And that clarity doesn't yet really exist. So Alistair's point about welders, I think, is well made. The second big barrier is that the revenue streams for carbon capture usage and storage businesses are not yet well established. Many of them today depend upon policy enablement, and the non-subsidy revenues are relatively immature. But if we take a step back and look at the scale of what it's going to take to expand this industry, we believe there's about $130 billion of capital required a year to scale this up to deliver the kind of numbers that I was talking about earlier. Just to put that in perspective, it's about the same investment as we need for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It is highly implausible that we will be able to cover all of that from government subsidies, even though we're seeing them expand right now. Well, what that means is that for business cases to work, we're going to need to find alternative sources of revenue to scale up. The third barrier that we've got to overcome is that these projects so far have been large and largely unproven. In fact, I think largely unproven might be a slightly optimistic way of articulating this, because the track record of failure in carbon capture point source emissions projects is entirely consistent with many other first-of-a-kind projects. So of the 263 greater than 1 ton a day carbon capture projects between 1995 and 2018, 78% of the ones greater than 300,000 tons a year failed. And they failed. So there isn't a track record yet of delivering these things in a reliable and credible way. This links then into the fourth barrier that we have to overcome, which is that the cost benefits of scale come with coordination complexity. And they come with complexity in two ways. Firstly, This is coordination beyond the project itself. It's actually about the interdependency of the different levers that we need to pull. Annie closed the panel just now talking about how organizations and countries need to think about pulling multiple levers in order to get the cost-optimal pathway to net zero. Pulling multiple levers means that there is interdependence between different sources of carbon reduction. And so the way in which, say, carbon capture plays into the build-out of our hydrogen capacity is really important and not yet fully thought through. The second way in which you bring complexity as you build scale is actually in the project delivery themselves. So we've talked a little bit about hubs. In order for these hubs to work, lots of things need to happen together. Storage and transport and installation. And these aren't typical collaborations. The institutions that own and run these things often have different objectives, they've got different timelines, they've got different asset life cycles, they'll have different hurdle rates for their return on capital. Making them mesh is a difficult thing, made even harder if you want to try and scale these hubs out and phase them over time. And then finally, the fifth barrier is, and it's been touched on, I think, already, but carbon capture is, unfortunately, still controversial in public opinion. It's still sensed in some quarters that this perhaps enables the continuation of fossil industry and is perhaps not a clean technology. And of course, the answer here is yes, it does enable the continuation of the fossil industry because the continuation of the fossil industry is necessary, as we've discussed already. But we clearly need to do a better job telling the narrative, and I liked the way that again, the panel talked about it earlier. I think it was Alistair who was saying we have to be able to articulate how everyday products that we will need to have ongoing can be enabled by this technology. So, blimey, is all of this too difficult? Is this a sort of far too pessimistic? Do we need to find other ways of coming at this? No, I said at the beginning that I think carbon capture and storage, particularly for industrial point source emissions, actually has the greatest set of tailwinds and is ripe for acceleration. So let's talk a little bit about why that is, what's different now, and then we'll get into some of the specifics that I think companies, regulators, and investors should be doing. So what is different now? I think there are three big things that are different. Firstly, the NDCs that came out of COP26 clearly set the foundations for governments to get serious about regulating the stimulus of this industry. Secondly, one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine is going to be a general stimulus around climate technology, but particularly technologies that can abate the increased fossil fuel consumption that is a consequence of what we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now. And I don't want any of you to think that I'm trying to take positives out of the horrors that we're seeing in Ukraine, but we will see a stimulus of climate tech, and particularly tech that can abate fossil emissions. And the third thing that's different now is that I think it's most likely that the business cases for carbon capture and storage companies will balance more through revenue and less through cost than is typical. Now, we've heard a lot today about cost curves and how they accelerate and some of the precedents that we've seen in solar and hydrogen. So you might think that I'm standing here saying something completely heretical. It is absolutely true that wind and solar and hydrogen electrolyzers and things like this have shown terrific cost curve performance. But I don't think that carbon capture and storage is going to see cost compression in quite the same way. And that's because most of the projects are bespoke, and because many of the technologies that they work with, things like compression and pipelines, have already gone through their cost compression phase. So it's going to be different. Unless you have a modular or repeatable solution, you're not going to see the same cost compression effects that other climate technologies have. Now, you may have heard Annie using the words modular and repeatable already. This wasn't set up, because the other thing that I was going to say is that if you have a modular and repeatable solution, we would expect to see your cost advantage versus others improve over time as you get greater benefits from scale than will be possible in more bespoke solutions. So, for most carbon capture and storage players, it's going to be revenue rather than cost that will flip these business cases into positive territory. So where will those revenues come from? Let's quickly get past the first, because it is the subsidies that we've been talking about. I suspect that many governments whose balance sheets have been ravaged by COVID and then, protecting populations from winter fuel bills will be struggling to think about how to increase or bear further subsidies for climate tech right now. But nevertheless, we are seeing positive momentum. I suspect many governments are looking for things that are both impactful and cheap, a holy grail. And there are, of course, things that can be done to stimulate the industry beyond pure subsidy. Think about the EU's border tax coming in 2026 and what that will do to create headroom for green premia. Think about some of the regulatory backstops, for example, that the UK has put in place. So the UK's decision to phase out unabated gas power by 2035 creates a clear milestone for the adoption of this technology. So subsidies and other government actions is the first source of revenue. The second, I've touched on it already, is green premiums. There are plenty of examples of these. Look at virgin PET, trading at 10 or 20% above. I'm not saying that green premia are going to be universal. We can all see the different speeds with which this is developing in different sectors. But for carbon capture and storage, I think this is going to be absolutely critical. Vicente touched on it a little bit. In sectors that have got harder to abate emissions and perhaps where the portfolio of alternatives to carbon capture are smaller, like cement, for example. The third source of revenue, I think, will be thinking about how to use CO2 as a feedstock. Clearly, sequestration and waste management is always going to be a part of the business model. But how do we think about finding value from CO2 in enhanced oil recovery, in polymers, or even in cement itself, right? There are different ways of thinking about the CO2 as a source of revenue. And the fourth source of revenue, I think, is going to be from voluntary carbon markets. Now, this is very technical, very complicated. I could talk about it for an awful long time, but I think it's actually less relevant for industrial point source CCUS than it is for DAC or BECS and the other areas that can get to negative. So I'll skirt past that. But if you're thinking macro about CCUS business cases, that would be, I think, a further source of revenue. So we need to accelerate. It's different this time because the regulatory foundations are there. We've got regrettable external stimulus, and we've got revenue and cost playing in a slightly different way than it is played in different industries. So what practically should we do? If we're at a delivery COP, what are the things that we can do? So I'd like to just lob out some suggestions here for different bits of the ecosystem, I think all of whom are represented in some way. So for industry, build your business cases now beyond subsidies. Modularize where you can, and really think about how you can chase those alternative sources of revenue. Collaborate with other players in industry to share the burden of building out the broader infrastructure that is required to make these clusters and other point sources work. Get beyond the natural caution of customers who are worried about the track record of performance in installing these units by offering low cost, by which I mean low price, I suppose, demonstrator units to show how you can install, deliver, and prove the case. And then I think act as a unified industry body to be talking about how carbon pricing, ETS levels, other carbon tariffs can help stimulate the broader economy shift to low carbon products. For regulators, yes, of course, you need to do the package of backstops and structures and tax things that I've described. But here's where I'd like to talk a little bit about this mindset of playing offense. Now, playing offense, it's a slightly regrettable Americanism, of course, but playing offense is really about the mindset of saying, how can we use the sustainability imperative as an opportunity to drive growth rather than as something that needs to be defended against? McKinsey have been telling this story for a while now, because many of the companies that we speak to see the transition to a net zero economy as a threat to their cash flows, as a threat to their ability to get affordable finance, with the possible consequence that they end up with stranded assets. And so the defensive posture says, how do I protect myself against those things? And what we've tried to lay out is a mindset that says, if I think instead about the opportunity from shifting my portfolio, from building new green businesses, from decarbonizing my operations, from weaving all of this into a narrative that I can use with my investors, the opportunity for growth far outweighs the value at stake from a defensive posture. Now, we think the narrative of playing offense for a company works for a country too. And Chris touched on this a little bit earlier. He was talking a little bit about how the UK had been a pioneer in a number of these areas, but about how the IRA over in the US was potentially upping the ante. And he even mentioned his concern that players would go there rather than the UK because of it. He's absolutely right. Capital goes where it's loved. And so the notion of using your national climate change strategy, not just as a way of delivering your own decarbonisation, but as a way of exposing your country to the $13 trillion of investment pools that are being created by the transition, I think creates long-term value. So think about what IRA is doing for the US. It's creating jobs, reindustrializing the country, driving resilience and security into their supply chains. If every country could be thinking about how it captures a disproportionate share of that $13 trillion and generates jobs and reindustrializes and builds resilience into its own supply chains, that would be a terrific catalyst of the journey that we all need to be on. So I think that mindset is much more important than all of the specific policies and levers that can be pulled. And then the final set of thoughts that I'd have would be for investors. And here, I think investors should be insisting on bold ESG commitments from the companies that they invest in. And not just insisting on the commitment, but also thinking about how they can get clear and standardized reporting against those commitments, articulated through credible plans that boards can scrutinize. And then the second thought for investors is, because we're combining so many complicated things in these point source emissions projects, it's quite hard to take a step back and work out where value is created, where risk is held, and therefore what the appropriate way to share that risk and fund these projects is. And I think that investors can play a role stepping back and thinking about almost being, if you like, the honest broker across multiple industry players and thinking about how to scale some of those infrastructure decisions that we need. So there's a portfolio of things that cover, I think, industry, thinking beyond subsidies, modularization, revenue, getting customers beyond their natural caution, given our track record, governments playing offense, and investors using their heft to stimulate greater commitments across industry. I was at a dinner a couple of nights back where we were talking about energy technology, climate technology, green technology, and we ended up deciding that the best name for it actually is tough technology. It is tough. We need to accelerate at the speed of digital companies that have an asset intensity that is more like traditional manufacturing. It's not been done before. It's clearly tough, but it is necessary. And the importance of CCUS in that mix to deliver net zero is unquestioned. Arguably, it's been clean for a while, but because of the three changes that I described earlier, I think we're now at the moment where we can pivot forward. This is a land grab race. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. I think this was really, really eye-opening, and I do want to thank you and congratulate you and McKinsey for the leadership and thought leadership on how CCUS is actually going to be really, really important, but also making it really, really clear for other constituents in this in this audience and the people who are listening to us online, how there's something for everyone to take back and how there's something definitely happening for everyone to think about. We now have a quick networking break of 30 minutes, so we definitely want to invite you for some coffee and continue the conversation there. Thank you.
Yes, I can.
Because the trouble is, if I sort of...
You can speak here firstly, and you will find your mic here.
So if I stand here, should we just pop these out of the way?
Okay.
Because they'll be off, will they?
Okay.
And I can just... Or can I start by that and then go to the microphone when I sit down?
Yes, I will.
Is that
I will
possible?
put it here.
Yes. Okay. Do you leave it there open? Yes, okay. And then what I'll do, you see, is I can...
We can adjust it now.
Oops. Something about... Oh, hello. About there, yeah? It doesn't sound very loud, but are you getting enough?
When you come, we will
Yeah.
make a test.
Okay, because when I... Sorry.
Okay,
Should
what
say
we can-
testing.
what we can confirm.
Well, actually, I just
Test.
want... Test. Test. Because I don't want to lean forward into it. I'm now going to sing. No, I'm just going to, just to get you onto the stage, and then I'll sit here. So they're all individually going to have microphones on their speakers, are they? Or will you hand them different
One or another one.
4 plus 1. Sorry.
One.
Yes. Okay. And then you've got another one for the Q&A.
Yes.
So 5 altogether. Yes, that's fine. So they'll be on the seats when they come up, will they? Yes.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Hello and welcome back. Hello and welcome back to both our in-person and our virtual audience. I hope you've been enjoying our COP27 forum so far this morning. My name is Ian Tobin. I'm Carbon Clean's Chief Corporate Officer and CFO. And welcome to our next interactive panel. In this panel, we will be discussing cluster models and CCUS development strategies. I'm delighted to be joined by and to welcome onto stage 3 outstanding leaders to discuss this topic. First of all, allow me to introduce Madeleine Gilborn, Head of Clean Technologies at Alfa Laval. Next we have Ruth Herbert, Chief Executive at the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. And finally, Tim Bertels, Senior Partner at Darrell Group. Again, welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining our day and the panel today. May I start by asking you to provide a brief introduction. Madeleine?
Yes, so I'm Madeleine Gilborn. It's a pleasure to be here today. I represent a company called Alfa Laval. We are world leading in thermal heat exchanger technology. And what we want to do is to really make sure that the energy we produce are actually used in the most efficient way, whether it is for existing processes or also when it comes to the new energy transition, and not at least within carbon capture. And we've been active in the carbon capture space since the 90s and already been part of more than 30 projects. So it's a pleasure to be here today to represent the manufacturing side of this angle.
Thank you very much. And Ruth?
Hi, yes. So I'm Ruth Herbert, CEO of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We're a trade association leading on advancing the commercial deployment of CCUS, and we do that through advocacy and collaboration, working with governments. We have a London office and a Brussels office, so we mainly work with UK government and European Commission and leading member states in Europe. And we have over 98 members across the CCUS value chain, so not just the technology developers for capture and the storage providers, but people developing networks, shipping, and the end users, energy from waste, other gas-fired power generators, cement, and so forth. So we like to think that we bring people together to try and solve this problem of how to decarbonise at scale.
Thank you, Ruth. And Tim, please.
Yeah, hi, delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I have a history of 30 years with Shell as an engineering and manager, and I had the privilege of spending the last 10 years full-time on CCS and CO2 management. And that was, I was called Mr. CCS in Shell, so that was a very interesting time to help shape the CCS portfolio in Shell. I left Shell 6 years ago, starting my own consultancy company, helping to decarbonize industry, in particular in the Netherlands, but also worldwide. And I started leading the Porthos CCUS project in Rotterdam, to which I will say a few words in a minute. I also worked on the expansion of Porthos, and I'm now supporting the Alamis project, which is the successor, the bigger project even. I'm also a senior consultant to the Clean Air Task Force. And my company has also just launched a platform for carbon removal, connection to voluntary carbon offsets, and connection to buyers of offsets. So I'm also working in the BACS and the DAX space. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to frame this discussion around 3 questions. Firstly, what successes and challenges have been experienced by CCUS cluster developers? And Madeleine, would you go first?
Yes, I can start with this one. So we start a little bit on the success factors from a cluster development. From my perspective, and the ones that we have been part of, I think it's not a coincidence that US is the market leader here. And if you look at the latest Bloomberg numbers, I mean, they will represent 50% of the carbon capture market by 2030. And having the regulatory funding programs, policies in place, and also incentivize with the famous tax credits. It has really been a success factor for the US to take that leading position. And I think from our perspective, the key is not that they incentivize not just the carbon capture part, but incentivizing also the utilization and the storage at the same time, and taking a system thinking approach. Because that's when you see that the infrastructure also comes into play that enable these clusters to be developed, either by sort of supporting the clusters to come together, or by sort of finding collaborations that are so important for this to actually happen.
Thank you. And Ruth?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's the chicken and egg. It's a classic example, isn't it? There's customers for a system that doesn't exist, so they can't really move forward with it. And then there's people that want to develop a system, but they can't be sure of the customers. And so bringing those together in kind of collaboration, as you say, and there's been innovation funding and things both in UK and Europe and elsewhere to bring people together to design those clusters to make them as efficient as possible. So I think that's played a really key role in kind of getting over that initial hurdle. But I think what we've seen in the UK is just a couple of false starts, really. And Tim and I were just sort of lamenting about that before. But, you know, I suppose what that has done, it's taken sort of the focus from the industry on, okay, well, we need to get on and think about the most cost-effective way to deliver this ourselves as best we can, and wait for that moment when government decides it does need a lot of this technology all at once in a hurry, which is inevitable with the climate challenge, and to say, okay, well, let's develop the most effective way of deploying it, and let's get these economies of scale in clusters. And I think that's, you know, there's now been work, some of those projects within those clusters have been developing for over a decade, and they're bringing their experience and they're sharing it with industries that are just discovering about carbon capture and getting comfortable with it. So I think that's really helped to overcome that. And then there's also the sort of geological storage. We've got a lot of sites that are very well sort of characterised and moving forward in the UK, but there's a need for a further pipeline, which we're now seeing through applications to the NSTA. So yeah, those are all challenges, getting that storage ready for when you're going to need it and investing in it way ahead of when your customers are. That's a really hard business case, so that's why government's so important in this.
And I guess in terms of the costs and trying to fix those costs in a very uncertain, volatile supply chain environment has not been easy for these developers.
No, absolutely. And then the other uncertainty, I suppose, has been the CO2 price. But I mean, I'm on a panel this morning with BlackRock, and they're very, very confident in the European, you know, in the ETS price. So I think that is changing. I think the signals are getting stronger. The direction of travel is getting clearer. But without, if you're in the, you know, if you're sort of in the supply chain, unless you can see repeatability in that, okay, I'm going to be able to work on that project and that one and that one, you're not, you know, it's very hard to invest in what is essentially a brand new sort of stream of business. So government can help with that by setting a long-term ambition, but then also a kind of clear multi-year program of activity that will be sort of pump primed or underwritten, if you like, by government. That's really essential. And beyond that, I think low carbon product markets, there's lots of opportunities to get revenue as well commercially, which I think will really start to happen in the 2030s in a big way.
Thank you, Ruth. And Tim, please.
I did bring a slide to illustrate what's happening around the North Sea, I should say, the North Sea Basin. This is a summary of a couple of projects going on. I could have brought the slides for North America, which is equally busy, if not busier, in terms of projects. And so what we see here is a number of CCUS projects in the making. Some are being delivered, others are planned. Cluster projects, so what's going right? I mean, surely something is going right on this sense, right? We are progressing with the number of projects that we have. So we're progressing towards hubs and clusters, which is really aggregating multiple sources with multiple sinks. We're progressing in terms of the understanding of the need for CCS and the policies that are surrounding these things. And we're progressing also in terms of the support mechanisms, in terms of subsidies and in terms of the sticks and carrots, as I always call them. So on one hand, the industry is being incentivized to move because the carbon price is getting higher. On the other hand, at this moment, at least in time, they're still being supported by subsidies that will phase out over time. I'm talking about contracts for difference. So successes in terms of we're progressing these projects, we have the policies and the mechanisms in place to make them work, and there are definitely a number of challenges. Would you like me to go there too? If you can give me the next slide. Definitely the challenges were mentioned in the panel this morning, and it was also mentioned by the gentleman from McKinsey. We have a couple of financial, commercial challenges, project execution challenges, and legal, regulatory, and permit challenges. And last but not least, we have stakeholder and communication challenges. So, for example, building clusters of CCS projects is challenging in the sense that you have to really physically connect multiple emissions with multiple stores. And for that to happen, to take final investment decision, you have to actually be very much synced. So you have to do this all in parallel, right? You have to take FID together along the whole value chain. That is a very particular challenge that plays out when you're scaling up in terms of hubs. So another one I want to pick out is, of course, still the public communication around CCS activities and the sustained political, societal support. I think we are improving in terms of providing a stable investment climate or an ecosystem for CCS, in terms that some governments are indeed providing a longer-term outlook of sustained support. In the Netherlands, for example, we have a climate law, we have a climate agreement in which says CCS plays an important part, and we have subsidies and policies. So this is giving some confidence to investors who will have to take FID for these multi-billion projects, because these clusters are big projects. And so that, for me, is success, but there's also quite a few challenges that we have to overcome. But we're slowly but surely making progress, I think.
Thank you, Tim. And we actually heard from the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore MP in the UK this morning. And one of his messages was that really starting with clusters provides a great catalyst for more distributed rollout of carbon capture and indeed for innovation in the supply chain. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, we talked about it earlier today also by Harry from McKinsey, that the cost curves really needs to come down. I mean, there has to be a business case, and we need to get the revenue streams as well. And in addition to, like, for example, hydrogen and electrolyzers and solar and wind, you don't have the same scaling capacities. So you need the standardization, you need the commercializations, and the main way to drive down cost is to get the shared infrastructure. So unless we can find these new ways to build these types of clusters, it's very difficult to sort of get this cost to come where it's really, really profitable to make a business out of it. Because I think, like, unless it becomes a business, you can't just have the policy part. It has to be a real business case. And then that is a super important part, yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's a challenge, isn't it, with, when you go for that cluster approach, the next question is always, especially, if you're in a heavy industrial site and you're not, for example, in the UK, if you're not on in a coastal region near a storage site, you're suddenly sort of scratching your head. Well, what does my decarbonisation pathway look like? I think we're increasingly seeing, we've got a working group on non-pipeline transport. We're developing sort of models for how that will roll out. We're increasingly seeing, at least if you're coastal but not near storage, you can use shipping. There are CO2 trains being planned. There are barges in Europe. So I think there is still an awful lot of planning that needs to be done, especially definitely in the UK for non-pipeline transport, but I think also within Europe overall for the infrastructure network. That is the enabler. That's critical. I think once that sort of trunk line infrastructure and the plan for how that will evolve over time is there, then I think you start to see people, they can make plans to connect to that in some way. We also have members looking at utilisation, and I think for early kind of smaller capture projects. They may not be full capture, but pilot demo, small demos. Utilization can provide a way to get some capture experience and get going. But probably what we've seen is certainly some things like CO2 heavy cement, things like that. Maybe there's not going to be initially a big enough market to kind of take all of the emissions from a plant, but we will see how that goes. There are people developing that in the UK. There's already an operational plant, Tata Chemicals, for example. So I think there are really exciting developments in that. I think it's going to follow very quickly behind, what's happening with the geological storage.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that the beauty, I think the importance of the hub concept is the role of the aggregator. So the aggregator really solves the chicken and egg problem, right? He or she puts together the transport and storage infrastructure for the first set of emitters, after which multiple emitters can connect at a lower cost. Because essentially you create economy of scale, right? So what you're doing is you break through that chicken and egg problem, you put the transport and storage infrastructure in place, you can have emitters connect later to that same storage, so you reduce the cost, you scale up, and also perhaps even more importantly, many of the first couple of projects were typically done by oil and gas operators who have their own emissions and they know the subsurface very well. But now you have quite a few more emitters in the future who actually want to be serviced in terms of doing the capture, doing the transport, and doing the storage. And so this is really very powerful model because they can just be helped, supported by the aggregator, by companies like Carbon Clean, the capture provider, to really sort of go upstream and service them completely from capture all the way to storage, and thereby you're helping them to decarbonize because they may not have the resources or the knowledge or, and so that I think is a very powerful part of this hub concept.
Yeah, so capture as a service really is what.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you very much for that. Next, I'd like to ask you, what key learnings should policymakers and businesses take away from the experience of CCUS cluster development to date?
Should I start again? Yeah. So I think we touched upon quite a lot of them already. I think the system thinking approach, when you incentivize both for the capture side, incentivize for the utilization, which is going to be an important one, and also you incentivize for the storage. And then, as you said, Ruth, having the long-term perspective, get a transparent policy in place so that you de-risk the investments, so that you can create these infrastructures. And in some countries, the permitting could also be a very big bottleneck. So simplify the permitting process and make it faster so that we can also get this infrastructure so the rest can start connecting. I think that's sort of...
And Ruth?
Yeah, I had a slide for this, I think. I don't know if it's there, but I think, just do all the animation, that's fine. I think what I wanted to sort of try and illustrate with this is how industry responds when government sets a very clear goal and a timeline. So in the UK, there was a very clear goal in the net zero strategy, which is a very good strategy, actually. It now just needs to be implemented. But setting a very clear goal for, okay, we're going to have at least 4 clusters operational in the UK by 2030. We want at least 2 of those operational by the mid-20s. And industry went away and they came back with kind of 9, I think, or more clusters, still counting. Solent cluster was launched a few weeks ago. New hubs are being launched all the time. So the industry has kind of responded with gusto really to that, and across all of these sites in the UK that are the circles on the map there, that represents about 70 million tonnes of demand as of March this year, and 60 million tonnes of that was demand by 2030. So these were sites, they were the industrial power, hydrogen production sites that said, we would like someone to take our CO2 away from us by 2030 if possible. And that's what we're planning to internally in our business planning. So the demand is there, it's huge. But we have this competitive process, so that's fine. We have process, and industry has responded to that process, and we see the massive outcome of that. So the phase 2, so the first 2 clusters that were selected were the East Coast cluster in the northeast, a HyNet in the northwest, and the Scottish cluster as a reserve cluster. All of these clusters have the potential to be ready for the mid-20s, but it's very much reliant on the government moving forward now with the next phase of this programme. The phase 2 projects, which I've shown up there, they then went through a competition to apply for the right to connect to those networks and to get contracts for difference that will pay the difference between, as Tim was saying earlier, operating with CCS and operating without CCS. And that a portion of that top up will flow through to those transport and storage operators to pay for TNS. And as we were saying before, that will be a decreasing part of the, you know, that subsidy will decrease over time as we add more emitters. But over 41 applied, 41 projects were eligible and met the criteria from the government. 20 were shortlisted in August this year. That was a delay. It should have happened in February, then it was delayed to May, and then August. We are now kind of waiting for those contracts to go through their bilateral negotiations and be signed. You know, that needs to happen next year if we're to stay on that timeline that government set. But I think it's a positive story of government setting a clear ambition, industry responding, you know, in droves, and there's a lot to choose from here. And I was having a really interesting debate in, you know, has the US got it right, has the UK got it right, which is the, you know, clearly there's a lot of capital interest looking at US now because there's a clear framework. But the IRA, yeah, I mean, I think the difference is here there's a clear commitment to a long-term strategic model for how the transport storage infrastructure will operate. So in the UK, it's going to be a regulated asset, and it's a private investment and transport and storage fee. I think the difference is if we had the CFD, but it was fully available, and you just had to meet some eligibility criteria like tax credits, like the 45Q, I think that might actually be the perfect system. And what I say to governments all the time is there's natural phasing in this. They're not all ready now. They won't all want to be coming online in the year 2030 either. There is a natural phasing across these regions and across projects within regions in terms of when they'll be ready. So I think that's my lesson really is, you know, industry has responded, they've come together, they've collaborated, and when they collaborate, they come up with amazing plans that could, you know, decarbonise sort of 15, you know, maybe 10% of UK's emissions, you know, really quickly. We now obviously just need to make sure that mechanism is available and there's a multi-year programme to deploy.
Thank you, Ruth. Tim?
Yeah, I second all of that, I would say. I think the most important thing for the regulator to do is to provide a clear ambition, a clear plan ahead, a stable investment climate for CCS investors. These are investments taking place for at least 15, 20, 25 years. Significant amount of money involved, so you won't do that if you don't have the stability in the planning. I think commerciality is obviously extremely important, and whilst we are still lacking that, because the price of emitting carbon is still lower than the price of doing CCS, right? As long as we're having a lower price, there needs to be some addition to that. Contracts for different scheme that Ruth was talking about is also applied in the Netherlands, and that is really kicking off CCS, right? Without those incentives, it's not happening. But it is happening in countries where these incentives are in place. The DOE spent quite a bit of money, and now we have the IRA. The Albertan government put quite a bit of money on the table for instance, the Quest project. We have Norway, UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, etc., and also in the Middle East in this area. We have emerging projects. So that stable investment climate, the commerciality, or at least pseudo-commerciality with the CCFD scheme, that is really supporting a lot. I would say that actually when it comes to Europe, Brussels in particular, we still have a lack of a clear strategy on CCS, of clear ambitions on CCS. of a clear recognition that we need a lot of CCS, quite a bit more than we're doing today. So I would actually argue that we need quite a bit more on that side, whereas individual member states may have some of it. Brussels still doesn't really have it. I know they're working on it, but we need to speed up. So.
Thanks, Tim. And I would echo that point. I think we need legislation and we need financing that's clear over a long period that investors, developers, and innovation can respond to. So thanks for those answers. The final question I'd like to ask, and then hopefully we'll have some time for the audience to ask some questions, is how do you think these learnings can be applied to growing CCS use outside of those industrial clusters?
I start again. I think it's very important to look at the learning from the clusters. I think I was in a panel yesterday to only talk for specifically about BECCS, for example. Of course, it's the same thing, right? Unless you can find partners to collaborate, you can't scale. So looking at the clusters, the way you look through the value chains, the way you look at the infrastructure and find these unique collaborations, there is so much learning into that. So absolutely.
Thanks. Tim, maybe?
Yes, happy to take it. I think this comes partly back, I first of all, I agree completely with the importance of extracting the learnings from the earlier projects and from, in particular, from the hubs projects. How can we grow? Where can we do better? And I think we need much more global collaboration on that in terms of really working more efficiently because we have no time to lose, essentially. I think the second thing is going back to the aggregator concept. I mean, to connect more remote emission sources to the existing transport and storage chains, you need an aggregator for that. You need indeed barges, you need ships to really, pipelines obviously, to bring it to the trunk lines of CO2. I think it is important to actually start making almost a kind of a master plan, going back to the North Sea. How are we going to scale up from the couple of tens of millions of tons to maybe 500 million tons per annum in 2050, right? Because that's where we need to be. So how are we going to do that? We're certainly lacking a kind of a master plan working together around the North Sea Basin, how we're actually going to put all those Lego blocks together and working it to a much bigger scale. And then trying to link up over time all the emitters that we know where they are, all of them actually around the clusters and in the hinterland, in the mainland, connecting industrial clusters who are inland, like North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, for example, is one example. But there are multiple others, and the same, of course, in the US and Canada. I think it's happening, but I think we need to really orchestrate it a little bit more. So yeah, and finally, if I may, I want to say one more thing. I think, coming from an oil and gas industry and a big company, I know that it is very difficult actually to make the decisions in terms of, do we go into CCS? How fast do we go into CCS? How big do we go into CCS, right? So the question really is here, what is the incentive to make them move, to really make them move in a much bigger, at a much bigger scale? Is it indeed pure commerciality? Is that enough? Or is there more needed to actually collaborate and bring them across that? Because otherwise it will, I fear it will take too much time. It's little steps still.
Thanks, Tim. Ruth?
Yeah, I completely agree with you on the sort of European CO2 market, if you like. There needs to be a vision for that. What does that look like? The shipping, the import export hubs, and alongside hydrogen, what does all that infrastructure look like? Where do we expect the main flows to be? How big will they be? When will they be needed by? To start planning that, really, it's a whole new network. And yes, like any network, it will start with these small regional, almost like private wire networks you see in electricity, but it will very quickly need to become a very integrated network using shipping and so forth, which provides important resilience for stores, and multiple stores, off-takers stores for other stores, so that there's resilience in that network. So I think that's a real priority. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to get governments to think about cross-border infrastructure as well. So, you know, couldn't start early enough. I think we started when we were doing the North Sea Basin Task Force. I was on that when I was in government sort of 12, 14 years ago. So that thinking is there, but it now needs dusting off. We need to look at now the very clear net zero challenge, the timescale, and actually design something that's fit for what we've got to do. We've got to go from not a lot to a huge amount in a short space of time. So for me, I think there's also a sort of ownership, there's an ownership question about this, is actually we want regions to own that challenge as well, and to see that this is a route for them to be part of the transition. So it's the just transition theme. You know, this is actually an opportunity for industrial regions to reinvent themselves around the, you know, green economy, and to be leading in that. So back to the question of why go big, why go soon? Well, I think it's increasingly clear that if we don't offer this low carbon infrastructure for these regions, then, you know, it's very hard to see a future for heavy industry in these regions going forward. And it's absolutely tied into the economic growth strategy for a region and the buy-in of the people in that region to climate change and to be being part of that solution.
And I mean, if we are going to roll out carbon capture to the more distributed industrial sites, of which there are a lot away from the clusters, leveraging and innovative ways of leveraging the transport infrastructure to get that CO2 to these large storage facilities is something we need to be looking at now if they're going to be in place as we scale up, because only focusing on clusters won't solve the problem.
I mean, if we've learned anything, I think it's that we've learned that we kind of need to be planning several stages ahead at all times and have a rolling kind of 10-year plan, you know. So there's the phase we're in now, get the first projects done, get some initial trunk line, pipeline and storage infrastructure in key regions, get a few big emitters done, start that going. Because that, as you say, it will just go. When people see the infrastructure's there, they'll want to connect, this will pick up. But if we haven't, in parallel, been planning the next phase of rollout and putting all the bilateral or multilateral agreements in place and getting the legislation and the funding and business models in place, when we get to that point, we won't be ready. And so I think we've lost so much time already that really it's that vision really from how we get all the way from now to 2050 that needs to be set out really clearly.
Yeah, I mean, at Carbon Clean, we're seeing very, very strong appetite for innovative, modular, highly efficient units like our Cyclone CC solution, which is very deployable, you know, ready to go. And so solving these problems is really important for the industry as a whole.
Yeah.
Well, look, sorry, did you want to add something? I was just going to
say, I think the modular capture is really, really exciting, because not only, I mean, even in the sort of testing phase and being able to have something that's portable you can take around and test and things like that, I mean, it just shows how far the technology's come from people thinking about this sort of very bespoke designed facility that is unique to each site it's on. We get to modularize that. We get to say, okay, you know, this is a plug-and-play system. Sign here and we'll take away your CO2 and we'll deal with everything else, including engagement with the network and everything else. So I think that's really powerful. And when I speak, you know, we have a couple of end-user members. We don't have enough end-user members because they don't have time to engage with the stuff. They've got, you know, other things going on, energy bills and things to worry about, international competition. But they know they're going to need it by a certain date and kind of just want to know it's going to be there. And I think the modularization is a really key part of that.
Yeah, and these smaller sites, you know, these customers want a full service. They don't want to really think about carbon capture. So carbon capture as a service is, again, an area of great interest with those with distributed industrial sites. Tim, I think...
I fully recognize it, because we talk a lot about hubs and clusters here, which is the big scale, but absolutely, I mean, there's so much to be gained by doing this at a small scale at many sites across I get so many requests from industries, small industries who, as you say, Ruth, they know that they have to do something, right? Yeah. They have a set of options that they can do. And if they can be serviced by indeed doing CCS, then they might more easily choose that, right? Or do it alongside other things that they have to do to decarbonize. This is, of course, let's say the countries in Northwestern Europe, particularly under pressure of the regulatory regime. But the same applies to countries all over the world as time develops. So I think what is equally important is the replication of the working concepts into other parts of the world, and really more proactively go towards the small emitters and approach them and put the right framework in place to make it happen.
Yeah, can I just comment on that?
Please,
I think modularization is extremely important with all clean technologies, and it's the same, of course, for carbon capture, because when you go for modularization, you start to standardize. By standardizing, you reduce the cost, and you also de-risk it, and you get it easy out as well. If we talk about the public opinion about carbon capture, you deploy it. So you solve a lot of things so it's a complementary pathway to the big scale grid projects, which we also need. So I think it's super important as well. Yeah.
And that's really where, legislation such as the IRA and 45Q tax credits are really helpful to provide a capture as a service model where customers can pay per ton captured. They don't have to come up with funding and balance sheet funds for that exercise. Well, look, thank you very much for answering those questions. We have just a couple of minutes if anyone on the floor would like to ask a question. So.
Hi, thanks for that. My name is Lin Lu. I'm the CEO of Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization out of Singapore. So you talked a little bit about shipping, and so that's really where my interests lie. I think there are twofolds within shipping. Because international shipping's emissions is counted separately, so we have a strong interest in decarbonizing ourselves. So we just launched a shipboard carbon capture pilot, in fact, with Alfa Laval as a partner. So that's one interest. The other interest would be shipping as an enabler for the energy transition. So you mentioned shipping carbon dioxide around. So I'd love to hear from the panel how you think about these transboundary issues, right? Long-term risk, liabilities. We heard a lot about loss and damages at this COP. I mean, how do you think about all those, right? In the event of a leak, is the emitter responsible? Is the person that's storing responsible? Are the hubs responsible? And then ultimately, what role does a government play when it comes to risk and liability? Thank you.
Yeah, if I may say a few words about that. I mean, obviously, we had a long history about the London Protocol in terms of shipping CO2 across the border. I think we're slowly making progress on that. And individual nations are making individual agreements between each other. For example, Norway and the Netherlands, I think, have an agreement. I'm sure that the UK has an agreement. So we're overcoming those implementing problems, if you like, of moving CO2 around. I think it is very important for the government to actually set the regulations around who owns the CO2. I can tell you that in the hubs and cluster concept that I spoke about, certainly in the Netherlands, but I think all of them around the North Sea, of course, at a certain moment, the aggregator takes over the responsibility, at least operationally, for the CO2, stores it, and then keeps it there for, say, maybe 10, 15 years of operations, and then later the government will have to take over the long-term liability, because no company will do that. So equally, I think, for shipping CO2, it will be the shipper, most likely, who will take over the CO2 responsibility whilst it is on board, unless you have a different legislation in place. But I think I see this emerging. I mean, when I spoke about shipping and barging, it's the smaller stuff around the North Sea, but I can well see that this is going in a much bigger scale, and then we haven't even talked much about it, but of course you can link it to the whole ammonia and hydrogen shipping, which can be made from fossil plus CCS, obviously, which I think should be made to some extent by that. And so then you create a whole new kind of business area where you actually ship ammonia and hydrogen, but also CO2, perhaps even on the way back.
Anyone else?
I mean, there are companies looking at this already, and some spoke at our conference a few weeks ago, saying, you know, okay, shipping is more expensive, but it will become comparable, and you know, with other things that we ship, you know, it will look attractive to be doing shipping in certain cases. I think obviously when you get big volumes, you know, you will try and do a pipeline, but I think, you know, shipping will be a huge enabler, and it will continue to be really, really important, as I said, for kind of resilience of those pipeline and storage networks. So yeah, I absolutely see that as being a very big part of the system that we were talking about. I was at a conference in Japan. Japanese were speaking about, you know, the fact that all of their industrial emissions on one side of the island and all the stores are on the other, and they've got such a dense population in between that they're probably going to ship there. So even though it's a further distance, so I think there are regional specifics here that need to be taken into account in each of these systems, but there will also be a degree of interconnectivity between them as well, and that's where shipping comes in.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been a thoroughly interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the panel very much for your valuable insights and interesting discussion, and thank the audience also for joining the session today. Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to Anuruddha, our Chair and CEO, for closing comments.
Right. So again, thank you everyone, and I think it's always good to be closing after such a nice panel, joined by the panelists. You actually literally don't have anything to close to, except saying thank you. But I wanted to take the opportunity to maybe just quickly summarize the time we spent here, the day we spent here, just talking about. I think we started with Chris coming in first in the morning, and the kind of thoughts he's hearing and listening from the industry, and how important it is for the industry to actually come forward, but at the same point of time, how important it is for the governments to stay on the net zero ambition. After that, we heard a bit from business leaders like Alistair from SSE, Yoichi from Marubeni, and then we also have Vicente from CEMEX. I think it's extremely clear that CCUS is a part of the wider decarbonization strategy. There is very little chance the heavy industry could achieve full decarbonization without CCUS. I think that goes without question. We also heard about their key projects and the investments they're moving. For example, KEED-B project from SSE, the CEMEX Lütelsdorf project in Germany, and in Japan, the TCC project from Marubeni. I think all of these are pioneering projects, really solving the way, paving the way for the industry to start investing and really considering CCS in a very, very short to medium term. I think there was a discussion on resolving the supply chain issues, which I think is pretty pertinent in current context, and a lot of people are thinking about it. It is a difficult challenge, and I think we just have to keep at it. We are doing our bit to be able to solve that, and I know for a fact the whole industry, Madeleine from Alfa Laval talked about their efforts to scale up the supply of equipment for the industry. So I think people are working on it, but again, as more and more clearer framework is provided by the government, I think they will have even more investment and even more people working to solve those challenges. We then had Harry from McKinsey coming in, talking about how CCUS fits into a wider context, and thank you for doing that. I think it's very important that all of us here in this community take these messages back and play it back to our governments, to regulators, people we don't necessarily generally talk to on a day-to-day basis, but how important it is for them, regulators, to actually understand what CCUS needs to be regulated for. And I don't think there is a very, very easy, correct answer. You also talked about how CCUS and some of the technologies like CCUS will provide opportunities within that $13 trillion investment bucket and basket that need to be moved into the climate finance. And then lastly, we just heard from the panel on clusters and supply chain. We had Madeleine from Alfa Laval, Tim from Bertels, and Ruth from CCSA. I think the projects and clusters are progressing forward. I was very, very pleased to actually see the slides from both Tim and Ruth, the number of projects and clusters moving forward. I honestly actually didn't know that many clusters are progressing forward, but I think we definitely are growing by weeks. Every week we are having more and more people joining. So I think market signals are getting extremely strong, and the companies are committing to taking action in a certain defined time frame. We definitely heard about the challenges we face today, from a commercial, from an execution, from the permits and the public communications point of view, and I actually pointed towards this very early, first thing in the morning, that we do need public on our side. You know, I was having a discussion with one of the politicians from the UK about the government framework and the urgency, and his very simple question to me was, well, show me number of people standing outside the parliament with placards. Right, so I think it's very important that we get the public on our side, we get them comfortable, and then they understand that this is actually about them. It's actually about ensuring that the new green jobs and investment going into their sectors, and they will be impacted by that. We heard about the role of CFDs, contract for difference. They've done wonders for the renewable energy. Alastair talked about how initially the offshore wind was £100 megawatt hour. It's gone down to £40 megawatt hour in a very, very short span of time, given the life scale of these projects. So CFDs remain extremely important. And lastly, the role of the aggregators and why the aggregators are so important if we are to sort of go ahead and make CCUS a big success. I think to be able to achieve the ambition for 1.5 degree, I think we'll need to significantly scale up deployment. There's no question in that. But I think we will not be able to do that just by taking this is my own project type approach. There is a much more collaboration required. We heard about how cement companies are thinking about carbon capture utilization into aviation fuel. That is something completely different industry, but at the same point of time, a very hard to abate industry. We heard about sustainable aviation fuel, so shipping and aviation, how do we decarbonize that? And I would say it will not be an understatement to say that if we have to achieve the scale around decarbonization, Harry talked about 700 million tons of CO2 to be captured between now and 2030, I think we would probably need 5 to 7 companies of the size of BP doing this on a full-time basis. Just think about the investment that will move, the opportunity it would create, the jobs it would create. I think there is something that's big in making here, and we all should continue to do that. Lastly, I would say Carbon Clean, we're doing our work. We're trying to push the envelope on both technology, on ensuring that the technology and equipment can be delivered on time, on budget, but we are also coming up with new business models, for example, partnering with companies like Marubeni to see how we could make access to technology and financing easier, cheaper, and more accessible. I want to thank all of you here. Thank you for taking our time. It's actually the places like COP27, these conversations happen, and we all go back and take these conversations and feed it back into our organization. It's all about a joint concerted effort that we all need to make, starting from here, but then continuing in the years to come. So thank you everyone for joining in today, and both in person and online. We'll have some networking time, and the lunch will be served outside. Thank you.